mihi munera sutra in rebellis verum est volegitur fronte campillata sed rerum crescem.
Galileo went down on his knees in a penitent's shirt and confessed to the crime of heresy. He was broken. Now, one of the famous incidents in the story of Galileo, and it gets to the point that we're going to talk about today, is that Galileo was threatened with the standard tool for the unrepentant heretic throughout the existence of the Inquisition. How do you get someone to confess to a thought crime if they refuse to confess? Well, the simplest and most effective way to do that, the Church very early on discovered, was to torture them physically. It was to put them in a torture chamber and apply the instruments of torture to their bodies. And men and women and children, by the countless thousands, were in fact tortured. It is a fact of the Inquisition, and this is a very significant fact, and it's one of those items in the inquisitorial toolbox, that the inquisitorial cast of mind depends on absolute control. The inquisitors were control freaks. The Catholic Church was a control freak. It wanted to control everything, even what you thought, what you did and what you thought. And so they insisted that you yield your freedom of thought, to submit it to the approved dogma, and if you refused to do that, they would torture you into doing it, torture you into confessing your crime and embracing the dogma that you had previously rejected, and they would do it according to the most rigid and precise rituals of torture. The control freak nature of the Inquisition is best expressed in the way torture was applied. What do I mean by that? Let me start you with one of the fingerprints of the Inquisition that is found in our own culture. We use the phrase from time to time, giving someone the third degree. You've heard this phrase, it's in kind of noir mysteries, the images, some unfortunate victim of police violence who's dragged off into a back room of the station house, and there's a swinging lamp and a beefy cop, and he's working him over in the back room, maybe with a rubber hose. That's called giving him the third degree. The third degree is a borrowing from the inquisitorial toolbox. The third degree refers to the fact that the Inquisition measured out torture by degree. It recognized 5 degrees of torture. The third degree was the kind of the middle level of torture. And the way they measured torture, not having accurate time instruments, they measured it by the amount of time it would take the priest to recite an Ave Maria or a Pater Noster, the pious prayers of the Catholic liturgy. Not very long prayers, I might say. But as long as it took the priest to recite the Ave Maria, that's how long the hot tongs could be held to bare flesh. That's how long someone could be dangled from a rope tied behind their backs. That's how long their head could be held underwater. That was the third degree of torture. The fourth degree was measured by the prayer known as the Miserere. Now, Jews don't quite get that, but the Miserere is one long prayer. It's like the Shemona Esrei. It's a long prayer. Now, what was the first degree of torture? We've talked about 5 degrees. Galileo was threatened not with the third degree or the fourth degree or the fifth degree. He was only tortured with the first degree of torture. Does anyone know what it was? It was simply to be escorted into the torture chamber. I'm sorry. It meant to be escorted into the torture chamber and shown the instruments of torture. There are the tongs and the hammers and the ropes and the irons, the bucket. That's what we're going to do to you if you do not confess. That's the torture that Galileo was threatened with. And it says something very, very profound about the use of torture. Torture is based on fear. And fear does not require the actual application of the instruments of torture. Once it is in the mind of the victim that these instruments will be used, the torture has begun. This is a very important point. It was terror that was the principal weapon of the Inquisition, and it's terror that was the principal weapon of every authoritarian regime, and it was terror that was the principal instrument at Abu Ghraib. The fear of torture. Now, to be sure, in all of those places, they were not so fussy as to stop there. They certainly did apply physical torture. In my book, if you find your way to it today or some other day, you'll see that I took all of the messy, heartbreaking, revolting details of torture and execution by decision, and I put them all in Chapter 4. Be forewarned, Chapter 4 is where the guts and blood is to be found. And I did that because I realized during the research for this book, when I was immersing myself in some of the most horrendous things that one human being can do to another human being, really horrifying and heartbreaking things, that there might be some people who don't want to subject themselves to this. So I isolated it in Chapter 4. But my experience has been that now that you know, most people crack it open, take a look. That's human nature too. Isn't that a reason to torture? And of course, that is the rationale of the Bush administration in the war on terror. That we're wusses. We're not strong enough, or we should be strong enough to use torture against our enemies. And we suffered on 9/11 because we were so timid about it. And we shouldn't be so timid. We should toughen up. But the reality is that if what you want is actionable intelligence, things you can use in the real world, the torture is a completely inefficient way of extracting the truth, because the tortured will say anything, everything, anything you want them to say. Now, in the Inquisition, this took on some very interesting implications, and I want to share them with you at this point. By the way, before I get there, this is what happened to Galileo. Galileo, he did not literally look at the instruments of torture. He knew what they were. I quote in my book Bertolt Brecht, his play about Galileo, where he has the Pope telling the Inquisitor, show him the instruments of torture, but don't apply them. And the Inquisitor says, showing them will be enough. Galileo understands how machinery works. You know, he's a scientist. He's an engineer. But the point I want to make is that when the crime is not a physical crime, when the crime is a crime of consciousness, a thought, then the confession takes on a whole different tenor. It has a whole different function. It's not that you're trying to find out when are you and your co-conspirators going to take the box cutters and get on a United Airlines flight. What flight are you on? What hotel are your fellow terrorists hiding out at? It's not that. It's simply the confession that you are a thought criminal. Yes, I admit it. I didn't believe in the miracle of transubstantiation. I admit it. That's somewhat easier to get with the use of torture, and that's what Galileo did. Galileo knew perfectly well that science instructed him that the earth revolved around the sun. He was convinced that that was true. But he was willing to spare himself from torture and death by saying it wasn't true. So he went down on his knees, confessed that crime. You know, history records that he muttered under his breath the famous words, "and yet it moves," meaning, and yet the earth moves around the sun. That's just a little bit of romance injected into history. This terrified, half-blind old man did not mutter, "and yet it moves." He said what the Inquisitors wanted him to say out of terror of being tortured or killed.